Hello and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be talking about the possible use of a dirty bomb in the war in Ukraine, who would use it, and finally what the consequences of the use of it would be. And in this one I'll be featuring my brother.
Hello there, I'm his brother, and we usually talk together in the car. And I thought, why not just join him for this one?
So there you have it. In this one we'll be starting out with how or when or why and who would use a dirty bomb in Ukraine. So starting out. Alright, to figure out what this is all about, I've created a mind map and then we'll take a look at that. So starting out, who would use it? Personally, I don't think it is important to see and figure out who would use it, but rather the consequences of using it. So we'll have to focus on that. So starting out with talking about what it is. It is a bomb that can include either chemical or radioactive material. With this info, NATO has stated that if Russia uses this bomb in Ukraine, they are going to get involved militarily. NATO as an organization hasn't said this, however the United States and many other NATO countries have. This means in general it would mean dire consequences for Russia if Russia uses such a bomb. Then why do I think it isn't important to determine who has used it?
I don't think it's important who uses the bomb either way. The media will probably twist it either way. In Russia they'll say it's Ukraine, and in the West they'll say it's the Russians.
Regardless of who uses it, if it's used, the media will have a war on its own, talking about how the enemy has used it. So, moving on, what are the consequences? We have two roads. So what differentiates the two roads? We have to think about it this way. Either way, the West will say it's Russia, and Russia will say it's the West. So who is important to sway in this situation? The global South and Asia. This means anyone who isn't either Western or Russia needs to be persuaded that it is the enemy. So the West will try to persuade the global South that it is Russia, and Russia will try to persuade the global South that it's Ukraine. So these two roads are differentiated by who the global South believes. So we'll take road 1 as the road where the global South believes Russia, and road 2 where the global South believes Ukraine. So the first road is the one where the global South believes Russia. So in this scenario, we'll start out by talking about the explosion of the dirty bomb itself. The explosion of the dirty bomb itself will probably happen in Mykolaiv, which has been rumored so far, either by the Ukrainians blowing up their own city or the Russians blowing up Mykolaiv. But in this scenario, the global South believes that it is the Ukrainians who have blown up their own city to give NATO an excuse to participate in this war. In such a scenario, we will see the NATO forces from Romania as well as Poland entering Ukraine through Lviv towards Kiev, as well as from the south towards Odessa, and it will probably move through the border of Moldova or north towards the western regions of Ukraine. This will be to reach the front line as fast as possible here in the south, where they'll try to push the Russians out of Kherson and then force their way towards the east and the Donbass region. In a scenario where the NATO forces actually enter Ukraine, it will not be as a declaration of war towards Russia, but some kind of return special military operation, most likely a peacekeeping force towards the war. In a scenario where the global South believes in Russia and not Ukraine, it will most likely not be a NATO operation, but a US-led coalition. This would happen because all NATO members would not agree with this move, and it will most likely be some kind of semi-NATO operation, where most NATO countries will be involved but others will not, such as Turkey. In this scenario, the NATO forces will most likely not number more than 100,000, and they will send their carrier strike group that is situated around the Mediterranean Sea towards the Black Sea to blockade Russia in this area. But without Turkish support, it will be difficult for them to pass through and have proper control of the sea. They'll most likely try to block the Mediterranean Sea from the Greece point around the Aegean Sea. So my prediction from this is that it will be a very limited intervention by NATO forces, 100,000 troops and their carrier strike group to blockade the southern area, as well as the Baltic Sea. But other than that, they will not get involved further. This is to avoid a nuclear war. Russia will not engage in a nuclear war with NATO without the national security of Russia being threatened. This means as long as NATO does not involve with a large force or directly invade Russia, they will not use nukes. With the explosion of a dirty bomb, we may see some kind of limited tactical nuclear war engaged in Ukraine. But it will be limited to Ukraine itself and not Russia or NATO countries. So that's what I think.
Okay, there are some points I disagree with you and some points I agree with you. For example, that US will lead some of NATO's partners into a limited conflict with Russia. I definitely believe that, and but I don't think they'll just pour in soldiers to the front and just destroy Russian soldiers that way. They'll probably move their soldiers to strategically important cities and build up bases and then plan ahead. They'll probably make a base in Dnipro and move a lot of soldiers and then plan an attack to Melitopol. Similar objectives. I don't think they'll use nukes either side, even though the dirty bomb has been exploded and they have accused Russia of using it. They'll probably only use nukes in case of NATO actually attacking, actually just winning completely. If Russia totally fails, they might use nukes there, tactical nukes, but I don't see it happening, even if the West has accused Russia. The naval blockade thing, I don't think either. The whole idea with naval blockade is actually to deny Russia access in general, and also for NATO not to come in conflict with Russia. But in this scenario, NATO is already in conflict with Russia, in a limited conflict, no less, but still in a conflict. So there won't be a naval blockade. They'll have a naval battle, but not a naval blockade. So the carrier force group. Task force will probably just try and destroy the Russian Navy. The NATO and its allies have a really good air force that will help Ukraine massively. However, it's not only Ukraine who will get help in this scenario. Russia can also get help from Belarus, although limited. They'll probably help, and as well, we still haven't seen the 300,000 Russians. So that's my take.
Something to take into account as well is in this scenario, we see that the global south as well as China and India support Russia's claim and not the Western claim, which means that we'll most likely see some kind of support from them as well. Something like weapons donations, maybe volunteers, or as well as from Iran, as Iran is very aggressive situation right now as they are trying to set the position on the global stage and get involved with all of these great power politics.
China has refrained from helping Russia until this point, and if NATO just joins in on this special military operation, they might actually be the turning point where China actually decides to help Russia. Countries like India or the global south, they just stay neutral.
We could also see China taking this opportunity to start a conflict around Taiwan. With the United States being busy here in Ukraine, that would spell a great opportunity for them.
And also, another thing to take into consideration is when Russia started this invasion, the Ukrainians was actually afraid of the Russians at first. The Russians had a massive reputation of being the big, strong country that we all thought it was. But once the first javelin was launched and a Russian tank was blown up, the Ukrainians realized that in the end Russians are just humans, and now we have seen the Ukrainians have many successes in this war, as well as Russians has had some success. However, I think the same scenario can play out, just the reverse. When NATO comes, the Russians might actually just fear NATO a lot in the beginning, and this can actually help NATO make a massive breakthrough in the early days at least. That might actually make the Russian line collapse, even if they could have actually defended. So that's definitely something that the Russians high command should take into account, defending in this scenario at least.
That's a very interesting point. We have seen so far NATO forces against third world countries and Russia against Ukraine. where you haven't really seen direct conflict between Russia and NATO. And something very interesting as well is that NATO has a very large air force, one that is much larger than Russia's. However, they don't exactly have all their planes on the front line right now. This means that we'd most likely see a large-scale air assault from both sides. If NATO gets involved in this war, we'll see a lot of NATO versus Russian planes. We'll see some air-on-air dogfights and so on. So we'll be seeing something that we haven't seen since World War II.
So either we're gonna get awed by NATO, or we're just gonna say, okay, NATO is actually
not as good. Yeah, I agree. We'll either see some kind of amazing performance by NATO, or we'll see that they were exactly the same as Russia, overestimated, and that there's no clear difference between the technology and the skills of either side, and that most likely we'll just see some even fights turning out, and maybe we'll reach a stalemate as well. But as you said, the NATO forces are untested, and there's a large image that they have, which means that the Russian soldiers may be hesitant at first to fight them.
Because of course the NATO have lots of combat experience in the Middle East. However, they haven't gone up against someone with a large air force or massive air defense systems such. The closest is probably Iraq, and they had big success there. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Anyways, I think that's going to be it for the first scenario. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you will all come back for part 2. Have a great day.